أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وعلى السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So where we've reached in the third section, the last subsection we talked about was discrimination, where in the beginning of this subsection Shaykh Mutahari was asking the question, why are we seeing this so-called discrimination in the world, right? Why do we see the differences in beauty, in different species, different sizes, shapes, colors? Why is that happening? So he started off by saying that there's two different ways of answering it. So he gave an overview of what the brief or the very typical answer, the answer of the average mu'min, the average believer is. Regardless of their faith, everybody answers it mostly the same way, the majority do. They say that, number one, it's a secret of Allah's creation, it's God's creation, we cannot comprehend it. It's our intellect which is deficient, not God's doing anything that's unjust. The second, he said, so that the extension of that is that we have to humble ourselves then, right? And part of this humility is that there's a practical effect to that as well too. The third, he said that the problem with these kind of responses is people are not satisfied with this kind of answer, right? You can call it a secret, fine, but that's not letting us know why there's all these distinctions and all these issues. Or if somebody is understanding Allah through the world, through the cosmos, through creation, if they think that this world is somewhat broken, then they're going to attribute this, na'udhu billah, back to Allah then too. Because if their only way of understanding Allah, right, because the non-philosophical way was to go from effect to cause, not from cause to effect. So they said that, okay, this world is the shadow of Allah, His effect. But in the effect, we see all these problems, we see injustice, the differences, discrimination. So then they think, is there a problem then with God? And that's how many, unfortunately, couldn't get past that. So the analogy was, if this place, if this world, if creation is this mirror and God is being reflected through this mirror, so if we see a crack in the mirror, then they're saying, is there a crack in Allah? Is that somehow broken? Is there a deficiency in Him? They said that the way that this group of believers is trying to answer it is comparing God's wisdom to human wisdom. And they said we can't do that because even though you and I, we need causes and effects, we need wasa'il, we need ways to accomplish our goals, God doesn't need that. Allah doesn't need that. So why is it that this thing has to be created so that this thing has to be created? Why doesn't God just make everything perfect right in the beginning? If He can just do everything, kun fayakun. Well, why bother with that? So Shaykh Mutahari then says, we can't begin to even start talking about this quote-unquote problem of discrimination until we figure out the order that we see in creation, in the cosmos, in the universe. Is it something that is artificial? Is it kind of quote-unquote man-made? Or is it something real and dhati and inherent? So that'll be the first thing that we talk about in the next subsection, which he titles, Is the Order in the Universe Inherent? So, if we're going to try to answer this, we need to first figure out what is the difference between real order and fake order. Anybody have any idea? Accidental? What does that mean? Any examples in your mind? Say that again?
Like if you have a bunch of letters in your hand and you throw them.
Okay.
And words form.
You have a bunch of, let's say, Scrabble letters or something like that, right? In your hand, and you throw them, and they somehow make a word. It seems like it's ordered, but it's not actually ordered. Okay, that could be one example. Anything else in terms of differences? So, okay, based on that, then what would be real order? It'd be planned. Okay. So, if, let's say, I have a bunch of dominoes, right? I start laying them down one by one. and then I knock them over, it's supposed to fall in a certain sequence based on the way I planned it. Is that real or artificial order?
Depends. Higher order would be, depends on which.
So the way that you outlined it and defined it was, I planned for this. So would that be a real order that I planned, or is that now a fake order, or artificial? Anybody else have any ideas? Real and fake?
No, the only reason I say it's the real because it's following a set of cause and effect, okay? When it's following
Okay.
one and everything, but fake because it's not literally
In that sense, okay. So you're trying to tie in the idea of causality, right? So that's on the right track, definitely. Anybody else have any other ideas about real or fake order or artificial order? Okay. So the dominoes example would be an example of fake order. Another example would be, let's say I said, let's gather everybody in the room and we're going to form a line and we're going to order everybody by age. It might sound like it's real, but it's actually fake. And I'll explain in a minute why that's fake too. If we put everybody in those rows based on age, right? How, what year they were born, what day they were born, everything. Can that way that we've arranged them, can we rearrange the line any other way that we want? Can we go, let's say, from oldest to youngest? Can we switch it to youngest to oldest? Can we do it based on those who first came in, who were earlier, versus those who came into the class later? Can we make the line any way that we want? Is there really any difference in the way that we make the line? In order? No. That's what's meant by artificial and fake order, meaning we design it and plan it. We can make it whatever we want. And anytime you attend a class, sometimes they have seating arrangements. How is that defined? Well, it could be based on some plan. You put everybody in alphabetical order. Okay, that's a plan, but does everything have to happen like that? No. You can do it in regular alphabetical order. You can do it in reverse. You can do it in age order. You can make any order that you want. So going back to the domino example, right? So if I had, again, 1, 2, 3, I'm putting down all these dominoes. Let me write it down, maybe it makes sense, right? So I have first one, second, third, right, et cetera, laying them all down. Obviously, I tip this one, it knocks this one down, et cetera, et cetera. They all go like this. Is there any reason why this one happens to be the first one, this one happens to be the second, and so on and so on? Could I swap their positions? Would it make any difference whatsoever? No. Because it doesn't cause any difference, it's an example of fake or artificial order. Now, what would be an example of something real, meaning the order of it will never change, it has to be like this? So he gives, the easiest example I think that Shaykh Mutahari gives is numbers. So kind of fall through the same idea over here. So the first one that happens in a number line is obviously, well, let's skip 0. We start with number 1. All right, then we go to 2, 3, etc. Right, that's how number line functions, right? This way, and then negative infinity 2, right? Can we take any of these numbers and swap their positions? Can you take the number 2 and put it in the place of number 1 and it still maintains the same idea? No. That's obvious. Why? Because 1 represents something very specific. There's a specific, literally a value to it. In both sense of how you would talk about value, right? 2 literally is 2 ones. That's what 2 actually means, right? So that's composed of 1 and 1, right? That's how it works. And then you guys know basic math. That's how math works. That's what numbers are. They're all based on this. And you can do this at any point. You can never swap 2 things. Now somebody might object and say, well, no, that's just names that we're using. If I can call this 1, I can call this 2, I can use any name that I want. We're not talking about the words that are used in language. We're talking about what value it represents. That's something that's real. That's something that can never change. We didn't come in and define that, okay, you know what? 1 will start, and then 2 will come, and then 3 will come. We didn't make that up. So they say math is not something that was man-made. It was something that was discovered. It was something that was realized. It's based on a real idea of, as we were saying, kind of cause and effect, so to speak, right? Although it doesn't have to be based on cause and effect necessarily, but you see how the order sort of functions. Why? Now, because I'm going to go back to the point about cause and effect. Does 1 have to happen in time first? Like, do you have to have 1 happen and then 2 happens? Is that how a number line functions? Do numbers have anything to do with the concept of time? No. A number line is a number line, even if there's no such thing as time. So another part that he wants to get across is that don't bring your idea of temporality and time into this. That has nothing to do with it. Because somebody might say, well, what about, let's say, parents and children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren? Isn't that inherent and real? So not necessarily, because we're bringing in the idea of time and we think it's like that. But, and again, we'll get to whether that one is defined as real or fake. So, but don't take the idea of time, that's going to mess you up. That's not what we're talking about over here. It's talking about real inherent values. That's what's being understood. So now let's say another example of fake. Alphabet. The alphabet, however you order it in any language, is an arbitrary order. Right? Yeah, you might start with A, B, C. Could you have started with C? Yeah, why not? It doesn't really affect anything. Yeah, there's a reason why they did that. I'm sure there's some logical reason, but it's not absolutely essential that it goes in that order. Right? Okay. Does that difference is it clear, real versus artificial? Okay. So that's the first thing that we need to understand, what's the difference. Now, he says, okay, now that you have that, then the question is, what about humans? Each and every one of us as a created being, which one of these are we? Do we fit very nicely and neatly on this kind of number line? Like it has to be like this? Or are we just, you can place anybody in any other person's position and the same thing would end up happening. There's no difference. What are we in terms of the creation? We're real. So he gives examples that any single person that you know in history, any historical figure, if you take them and had them be born 1 minute, 1,000 years, whatever, at a different time, a different place, then they're not going to be that same person anymore. Even if we think about it from a physical perspective, the environmental factors, tarbiyah, whatever it is, that's not the same person anymore. That individual that we're defining, me, I was born on so-and-so day, so-and-so year, so-and-so time at this exact second, with these specific parents. If you try to put somebody else in that position, that's a different individual now. Right? So that is a real part of the order. He said that's the first thing you need to understand in order to understand that what he's going to eventually try to establish is that everything that's been created is based on real order, not fake order. Because the problem that people have, and the reason why they think that God and Allah is discriminating, is because he thinks that we're just a bunch of dominoes. That, you know what, this is an imam, for example, this is a prophet. Okay, technically I should have gone the other way, but you know what I mean. And this is just some whatever, let's say Yazid, or Shaitan, whatever. So you know what, Allah could have made Yazid the prophet. He could have made this person an imam. That's what people have in their minds. Meaning they think that it's just a bunch of dominoes. It's just like the alphabet. It's something that's just God is just making up as he goes along. What Shaykh Mutahhari is saying is that based on philosophical principles, no. Everything is based on this real essential order. And that's the kind of secret to understanding things. Of why there's differences, but it's not based on discrimination. Right? And that'll be in, I think, the next, not this, so there's one more subsection, and then the next one following that, he talks about how do we get to this idea of explaining it out. But this is the basic thing we have to understand first, that this is all based on a real order. All right, so we can go, if we understand that, we can move on to the next point. All right, salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Shaykh Mutahhari says, look, we're not just making this up as, we're a bunch of philosophers sitting in a room thinking about these things and we just made it up out of nowhere. He says, we establish this from the Quran directly. And that anybody else who believes in something different, then they're actually going against not just basic philosophies, but they're going against the Quran as well too. Inshallah, when we get to explaining the point a bit more, we'll see how the Quran is very clear about how the nature of Allah's order is one specific command, an amr, and it creates the whole sense of order that has essential traits in it. Now, this next subsection is kind of interesting. It seems it's out of place. So it's called a pleasant and lasting memory. And you can read a lot of different books by ulama and scholars. I myself haven't come across anybody else that speaks or writes like Shaykh Mutahhari. It's very rare that you see a speaker or an author, amongst the ulama, that when they go off on a tangent, they're actually speaking about their own spiritual journey. But Shaykh Mutahhari does this very frequently, and this is what this subsection has to be. So remember, this book, and most of his books were speeches that he had given, whether it was an Ashra or Ramadan or something. Then it was collected, turned into, like, was transcribed, sent back to him. He edited some of those parts, added in some, extra points, some ayat of Quran, things like that, and then it got published as a book. So this was obviously starting off, it was probably just he was speaking, and then maybe the idea came to him, I don't know exactly, and then he just started speaking like this. So what he says is that philosophy completely changed his life. That's what he says. And I'm not going to go through the whole subsection, but I would encourage all of you, read this subsection yourself. If you don't read anything else, fine, but at least just see how he's speaking about his own spiritual journey. He says that understanding this whole point about the order of the universe, about the philosophical nature and the proofs of God's creation and existence, he said this completely changed and raised his iman. And this is something that might seem a bit foreign to us because, as we talked about last time, in our communities, we're not used to hearing philosophy from the minbar. Nobody's describing these ideas to us. They're not talking about real and fake order and things like that. They're not talking about discrimination and differentiation. They're not even bringing different ideas in Shiism. People don't normally do that. But he said that when he began his Hawza studies, as he slowly began to master, based on his teachers, and he credits his teachers, of course, like any alim would do, that if it weren't for having the most outstanding teachers in philosophy, he doesn't take the name, but he's probably talking about Allama Tabatabai, right? Qaddasallahu sirru. And even Allama Tabatabai said that, he's like, it's like I had no student except for Shaykh Mutahari. Because Shaykh Mutahari understood the material in a way that no other student could. He said he understood it and he could teach it in a way that nobody else could. So we're very fortunate to be living in a time where we have the legacy of both of these ulama, great scholars. So he says he had a teacher that, number one, could teach it in an eloquent and elegant way to describe it so it was easily understandable. He said, and secondly, he said that there were some people that could easily describe philosophy, sure. He said, but my teacher was living these things too. It wasn't just some abstract idea, like I'm mentioning to you right now, right? He said, but my teachers were practicing this stuff. So they were living this idea of wahdatul wujud and God and universal being, all these fancy ideas. So they were living this, so we could see it in their personalities. So this had a big effect on his growth. So he said he started to, one by one, his teachers would explain these philosophical principles. And he's like, he could feel himself start to go in his iman. Now, he doesn't explain all of these principles in depth, but I'm going to mention them. He mentions them right in the book. So I'll mention what the principles are. Again, we're not going to sit there and go through all the philosophical proofs for what these things mean, but I want you to have a general overview so you have an idea of what are the kind of things that are discussed in philosophy, right? Just the two proofs or two ideas that he talks about. So the first principle that he mentions is, so I'll write the Arabic first. So al-wahid, sorry. لا يصدر منه So, al-wahid la yasduru minhu illa al-wahid. So, wahid means what? Right, one. So one, yasdur comes from sadir, means to come from, to emanate, to produce, something like that. So the one, nothing can be produced or emanate or come from it except for what? For one. So, or in simple language, from one, you only get one. A single entity or a single being can only produce one thing. Now we're like, okay, what does that mean? What kind of weird abstract stuff is this? Well, one of the major questions they have in philosophy is because they have a principle like this, and they have questions that if Allah, in terms of tawheed, Allah is what we call divine simplicity. It's unity. How from Allah, from this pure unity, do you get all of these infinite different things or near infinite different things coming out of them? How do you get that? Now, these are probably not things that you and I think about all the time, but because it presents a philosophical challenge. For the mutakallimin, the theologians, they don't care about this necessarily. They say Allah can do whatever He wants. But the problem is logically and rationally, because of this principle, they said it's impossible. One thing can only produce one thing. A single unified thing can only produce one thing. All right? So let me give an example. So the fancier philosophical way of asking the question is, how does multiplicity come from unity? Right? That's the idea. So again, we're going to use analogies, and they use them in philosophy, but keep in mind, as a disclaimer, any analogy that's given is always going to have some limitation. It's just, they say in Arabic, it's for taqrib al-dhahn. It's just to get your mind a bit closer to what the philosophy is talking about. That's it. So don't take it with a grain of salt, as we say. So, trying to look for, okay. You have a single light bulb over there, right? So that single light bulb obviously produces and emanates light all over the place. Do we ever say that it creates multiple lights? We say no, there's light that's coming from there. Right? Now, again, leave all the physics out of it, like, oh, we're talking about like photons, multiple photons and wavelengths. That's not the point over here. Even though there's multiple whatever wavelengths and photons or whatever else they're just talking about in physics, and I'm sure quantum mechanics even more, we still describe that one phenomena as single light, right? The light that's coming from that one source. That's what the principle is basically talking about. From one thing, you're not going to have multiple lights. You're just going to have one type of light. That's it. Now, within that one light, we say that there's tashkik, which means it's graded. The closer you are to that source, the more intense the light is. Right? The most intense is obviously at the source. As you get farther and farther and farther away from it, what happens? It gets darker and darker and darker. So now, the Urafa especially, they take those same analogies and they apply it anytime you see nur and zulamat in the Quran. They say zulm, which is oppression and or darkness, is what? Just being distanced from the source. That's what it really means. All right? So they say that's the analogy that they're trying to explain in philosophical terms, is why one thing, when it emanates and produces, can only make one thing. But they say, okay, but we have multiple areas where we see light. How do you explain that? Well, that's what they're trying to explain. But the principle itself is that from one thing, you only get one thing. Okay. Another analogy to maybe help out is if you had a single piece of paper that you just folded up multiple times. Right? Let's just say, I don't have paper here, but whatever. You keep folding it up long ways over and over again. It looks like it's one thing. As you start to unfold it, depending on how you look at it, it's not multiple things that are really coming out. It's the single thing that just keeps unfolding over and over and over again, right? When it was at its full folded source, it was just this one thick piece of paper, so to speak. As you unfold it layer by layer, it loses that quote-unquote intensity, whatever you want to call it. So they say that creation is literally the unfolding of Allah. That's what it is. It's one single reality, but all this is actually one reality. The source over here is the most intense, and Allah is just quote-unquote unfolding and manifesting, and it gets weaker and weaker and weaker as you go down to the lowest. And what is the lowest thing? Literally in Arabic, what do we say is the word for the lowest? Ad-dunya. Ad-dunya literally means the lowest thing, right? So dunya, because it's the farthest away from Allah. As you go lower and lower and lower, you start taking on different characteristics. For example, time and space. There's no time and space and matter and things like that over here. But as you go lower and lower and lower, things start to literally take shape. Right? That's how that happens. Anyway, I don't want to go too much into this, but that's one principle he talks about. The second one, and I'll skip the Arabic as well, basically says that, so that's number one. Number two, he says that the other principle that when he began to understand it really changed his iman and his life, is that the only cause, the only agent that has an effect in reality is Allah and no one else. The Arabic, for anybody who's interested, is La mu'athir fil wujud illallah. Right? There's no mu'athir, nobody who causes an athar, right? Who causes any consequence or can make an effect happen in existence except for Allah. Now, we take it at face value. That seems like, hey, doesn't that sound like the Ash'ari, Sunni stuff of predestination? Is that what it sounds like? We'll say, well, again, that's where the discussion, the nuanced discussion of philosophy happens. The question that they're asking when they're discussing this is, who in this reality is actually acting? Do you and I, when we're doing these things, when I'm grabbing this pen, is it me that's doing this? Or is it Allah granting me the ability, and through that power that He's enabled me, that's how this holding is taking place? So again, we already talked about the sort of unfolding idea. Like, where is this stuff kind of coming from? So to go back with a light bulb analogy, so we did a single one. Now think about, okay, like a chandelier or a fixture like that, or any of these fixtures that are sitting on top. So there's, like, these ones have 5 bulbs in one fixture. When you look at it superficially, it seems like each bulb is acting independently on its own, that they're all producing their own light. In one sense, it seems like that, and yes, it's kind of true, but it's not the full truth. Why? Because they're all being powered from the same thing, right? In this sense, physically, electricity, right? That same wiring is powering everything, all those 5 bulbs. So it might seem like multiple lights. It might seem like they're creating their own light. They have their own effects, but it's actually one power source that's giving everything. So this first question is kind of asking how do things end up in this reality? Like, how do you get all this different light? And then the second one is saying, well, what is actually acting? What is giving off the light in the first place, right? Who's the actor over here? And what they say is, no, Allah is that single power source that's providing this to everything else. So if anything thinks that it's independent, it's an illusion. It's fake. In Quranic terms, it can take the extreme Fir'auni sort of idea of ana rabbukum al-a'la. That no, I have independence. Or shaitan separating himself, saying, oh, Allah, I'm separate from you, just like Adam is separate from you as well, and we each have an independent existence. You are one thing, I'm something else, and Adam is something else. Right? There's a long explanation in Irfan about how they explain that story of the fall of Iblis, so to speak, right? And they don't explain it like the traditional mutakallim does in terms of, oh, shaitan was just being whatever, racist or, something like that. No, they say that this has to do with the fact that these basic principles shaitan or Iblis couldn't understand. And the minute he separated Adam from Allah, right, that he's looked at the unfolding, he saw that bulb, he said, no, that's something separate. My light is brighter, right? Literally in the same fixture, he saw his light, he said, I'm a brighter light, and that one is dimmer. And Allah's saying, no, that's not how it works. I'm providing power to all of you. But shaitan, Iblis couldn't understand a principle like that, right? Okay. So that's those 2 principles that he doesn't go into details here, but I wanted to give you some background because these 2 principles, when we get to the idea of discrimination and differentiation, we're going to come back to it and you'll see how this explains that inherent order in the universe. So there's another way that this actually does have an effect on other things too. If now, based on this principle, you can only have a unified or unity in being thing can only make one other thing. Now, this is where in philosophy, this is a place that only Shia philosophers and Shia Urfa can explain these things. Because even those of other schools of thought, they try, right? They say, look, from Allah, they have this idea, again, I don't want to go into too much. They say that there's this quote-unquote first aql, or first intellect. They call aql awwal. And that first intellect creates something else. And that second thing creates something else. That's actually how creation works. Allah doesn't just create all these things instantaneously. It's that the first manifestation is at this level, and then it goes down, and it goes down, and it goes down. It's something like that. And I know it seems a little weird, but that's how they explain it. But when they're trying to explain what is this entity, almost if not all philosophers and Sufis, they don't really have an explanation for it. But the Shia Urfa have the explanation for it. And they say this is where the concept of walaya comes in. I'm using walaya like this, not wilaya, right? Because there is a difference, right? There's wilaya with a kasra, and there's walaya. Now, in our parlance and the way that we normally speak, we only use the top one. We don't know that there's a difference, but there is a difference. Technically speaking, does actually anybody know that what the difference is between these 2? Sorry? Very good. So they both come from waliya, right? In terms of the waliya, which means to be close to something, right? To follow something or be close to something, right? So wilaya usually has to do with something that's more political or governmental. Political has to do with authority. So for example, the concept of wilayatul faqih is talking about a type of authority, usually the political authority, governing something, right? That's what it is. walaya has to do with closeness. And usually it has to do with the idea of there's a loving relationship between two entities, and that relationship is so strong that it's as if there's no space between these two things. So they say this concept of walaya, they say that the only way that something can be emanated and come from Allah is if something is so close to Him, it's literally got 1 foot, quote unquote, in Allah. Now it sounds a little shirky, but it's not. That they have no ego of their own. So they can get lost in this, at the same time, bring these things down for everybody else. So they become a wali, which the walaya then has different stages and levels. The highest stage is called imama. That's the highest stage possible, that you're so close, your ego is disrupted, and now you can explain everything that Allah needs to be explained. Prophethood, and there again, there's different levels of that as well too. All right, Nabuwa. That is technically a lower level. Now again, we know that not every Nabi was an Imam. Right? Now again, I know sometimes other Muslims get confused by this. Are you saying that Imams are better than prophets? Like, we don't even have that discussion. But in this sort of Islamic cosmology, they say the station of Imama is higher than the station of Nubuwah. So that's why that there are some Anbiya. All right, so remember, in part of Nubuwah, technically we have Risala as well, which is a higher one, right? Because when you're given a book, you're a Rasul, you're higher than a Nabi. So we say, look, even over here, from Nubuwah, Risala is higher than that, but Imama is higher than that. So sometimes you're a Nabi, meaning you're just there kind of, and I'm filtering the discussion a lot, just for time, consideration for time. A Nabi is kind of just like, hey, worship Allah, worship God, there's only one God, I'm the Prophet, listen to me, kind of that. And we know that most are these Anbiya who were just coming, whether they were just telling their own families or just their own towns, very limited fashion. Then you had the Mursaleen, the Rasuls, who usually had some Sharia or some book with them, something like that, right? So now they have new or expanded things to explain. Then beyond that, you have Imama, which now has a higher level of authority with it too. So what some ulama explain is that when you see some of these stories in the Quran, when you see that some of these prophets, these Mursaleen, these Rasuls are going through changes in their life, is because they are going from Risala to Imama and they haven't gained that stage yet. So they'll talk about the journey of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam or Nabi Musa alayhi salam, something like that. Another example that they give is between Nabi Yaqub and Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam. They say, because the story obviously of Yaqub crying for losing Yusuf, it's a very human thing. Like, okay, he lost his son, that's why he's crying. But the way that others explain it is that it's not because he's crying over a lost son. It's because Yusuf was actually an imam where Yaqub was not. So he was crying over the fact that his imam was in ghaiba from him. So this changes the whole dynamic of the story now. Right? So again, and obviously there are many books written on just this idea. Amongst the Urafah, there's different theories about how do you explain the levels and what do each of them have and what do they mean. But I want to give you an overview that this is not just some random philosophical stuff that somebody's sitting there sipping on their chai, like that's it, they're done, like it has no effect. This completely changes the nature of what it means to be an imam, what powers they have. When you talk about wilaya takwiniya and all this actually gives it meaning now. It puts the imam in a whole different category, in a whole different light, pun intended, right? What they're manifesting now is somebody, some entity, because Allah can only create or produce or emanate one. He can only unfold initially one time. Something else has to help with the rest of the unfolding. So at every step as it goes down to the dunya, something else is happening, helping along with these things too. And we'll get into some examples of this inshallah if we have time. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So another last point before we move on to the next subsection. Again, we all know that this is the types of stuff that we never really heard when we were younger. And maybe you're thinking, this is still too complicated, it's so abstract, who cares, I don't really need it. And that's fine. There are different approaches. Shaykh Mutahhari is saying that these ideas completely change his life, right? They change his iman. And I think that we would probably all agree that, generally speaking, people in the West, or at least this generation, this is the kind of stuff that they're craving now, right? A bit more philosophical stuff, irfani stuff, that's what they're after. And other generations, or let's say other societies, like the Eastern societies, they said, look, we don't need all of these things. We were fine just saying, obey Allah, read the Quran, obey the Prophet and the Imam, and we're good. And there's nothing wrong with that too, as we've explained previously. So an analogy to kind of maybe help understand is, I think this has happened too, is think about like a magician, like magic tricks, which I don't encourage, but I think we all know what they are. So there was a time in previous generations, people like Houdini and these initial magicians, whenever magic was done, people would just be astounded and like, wow, amazing, and that's it. They would just be okay with things being, as we say in Farsi or Urdu, pushte parde, like it's behind the curtain, it's okay. We don't need to know the secret behind it. It was cool, we were mesmerized, we were astonished, and that's good enough for us. But you see nowadays, in this generation, now this idea that, okay, we have to know what was the secret behind the trick. Tell us what was going on. How did this happen? Because we know that there's no such thing as real magic, so we want to know what actually happened over here. Teach us that card trick, or teach us how did you disappear, or whatever it is. So that's why in the past, you never had magicians revealing their secrets, revealing their tricks. But nowadays, it's like a whole genre of magicians literally coming out, and according to the traditional magician, they're breaking some sort of law, whatever, they're not supposed to do this. But they're coming and revealing everything, like, oh, here's the secret behind how we did this disappearing act, or whatever it happens to be. So there seems to be this generational difference, maybe, of people saying, I just want to be amazed by the trick versus I want to understand the trick. Now, again, everybody's different, but we want to make sure that we're not judging anybody based on their journey to Allah. Some of these things might be beneficial to somebody. For others, it might be like, look, this is not, I don't need this, and it's good. But again, the point of this whole book and everything Shaykh Mutahhari is talking about is that it's very clear that in our societies right now, there's a lot of people who need this, right? And again, it's very clear that a lot of this stuff is not going to happen on the minbar either. What speaker can come and talk about this? There's maybe a handful in the Shia world right now, but even that, it's a very tough thing to get across without visual aids and things like that. So that was it. That was just kind of his memory or sharing his experiences, which I think maybe we can connect with a little bit, inshallah. All right, we can move on to the next subsection. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Any questions so far? Okay, next one is differentiation versus discrimination. So we said, okay, fine. Everything is based on some real order, right? There's some secret there. Why, when that variation is happening, there's obviously these differences that are happening, is this Allah discriminating against different things or not? Is it unjust for Allah to actually say that this thing will be a prophet, this person will be an imam, this one will end up as a Yazid, this one will end up as a shaitan, this one will end up as a cat, this one will be a stone? Is that discrimination or not? Based on what we've said so far, what do you think? First, I guess, what's the difference between differentiation and discrimination? Differentiation is based on capabilities, like potentials, and discrimination is not based on it, you said. Right? So that's one way of explaining it, yeah. Is that in differentiation, they say that, because obviously we're talking about what happens when conditions and potentials and qualities and all these things are there. Say, okay. So over here, in this sense, all of those conditions, abilities, they're unequal over here, whereas in discrimination, the assumption is that they're equal. So again, we'll explain with examples to make it clear. All things, everybody, let's say, has the exact same potential and ability, but I give differently regardless. That's what would be discrimination, right? Simple example is like a teacher. Everybody put in the same effort, they all got the same answers on the test, same potential and everything, but I'm going to give different grades. Or you can say the other way around. Everybody did different work, I'm going to give all the same grade, no matter how much effort you put in. Okay, that's discriminating, that's not good. Differentiation, though, is that no, one student put in effort, and they got a good grade for it. Another one didn't put in as much effort, so they get a bad grade for it. Okay, that's differences, but that difference is not because of the teacher. So over here, the assumption is you have a discriminator. Somebody coming and saying, I'm deciding to give different things. Over here, as you were saying, the difference lies with that object or that person itself. So now, again, another example that I think, this one's probably the clearest one. So, we got a few different cups. All right, so we got a faucet. All right, we've got a couple different containers. Let's say this one holds 1 liter. Now these drawings are obviously not going to be to scale at this point. Let's do this one. Let's go. I think we can assume that's 5, right? That's kind of 5, almost. So we have one that's 1 liter, and both of these can hold 5, right? So now we bring all these containers under the faucet, right, to get filled up. If we put the 1 liter over here, the idea is that it can fill up to 1 liter. Then we take this 5 liter and we fill that up all the way to 5 liters as well, right? So we fill that up to the top. Fill this one to the top, fill this one to the top. Then we go to this one, but we only fill it halfway. So what are these all examples of, each of these things? Sorry? All of it is discrimination? Locked. Locked, I think the battery's going to die soon anyway. That's okay. One out again. Sorry? This one? That's okay. That's some, thank you. Why is that discrimination? Has the potential for 5, we only filled it up to 2.5. Now, if we're comparing just this and this, is that discrimination? Why? Different potentials, right? This one can only handle 1 liter, so it's only going to get 1 liter. You can't go over that, right? There's literally a spill. And this one can handle 5 liters, that's why it can be filled to 5 liters. So those are the differences there. So over here, over here, the cup can't say, hey, faucet, you're discriminating. Because the faucet, assuming that we live in a world where faucets and cups can speak, obviously, the cup is telling the faucet, you're discriminating, but the faucet is saying, I'm not doing anything, I can pour out as much water as you need. The problem is you can't handle more than 1 liter. That's your fault, not my fault. So the faucet here is not discriminating. In this example, however, there is discrimination. Because we'd say, hey, faucet, or whoever's turning it on and off, whatever, you gave this one its full potential, but this one you stopped halfway. So this would be the example of discrimination, whereas this is just differentiation. So hopefully clear. Again, potentials are different, that's why it's different, but over here, potentials are the same, but they're getting different amounts. That would be the difference here. Okay. So now, the idea, obviously, to put all this together, is that what we see in the world is this. My soul has a capacity of 1 liter. The soul of an imam has a capacity of whatever, 1,000,000 liters, whatever it is. So that's why there's differences. I can't be made imam because I can't handle that capacity. I can't handle that much. Okay, that solves it. There's still one question that lingers, though. There's still one missing element from this. Yes, the why. Okay, so the faucet didn't create the cups, or the person who's turning it on and off. The teacher is not the one creating the potentials for the students. They're just give it to. But Allah, you're the one who's made these cups. You created the potentials. You decided that this cup is going to have 1 liter, that this cup is going to have 5 liters, and that this cup that's also 5 liters is only going to have, half the amount. You were the decider in the beginning. So in that sense, it seems like you're discriminating then, or na'udhu billah, that Allah is discriminating. But we know that's not the case, so we have to figure out how does this happen. Meaning, at the beginning, going back to one of the initial questions we asked, at that quote-unquote beginning, when Allah was deciding everything, why did He decide to make all these differences? Again, going back to that question, why did He discriminate there? Why is it that when He saw and said, I'm going to form your soul, you're going to become Nabi Adam, this one will become Iblis, this one will become Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, this one will become Yazid, whatever. Why all these differences at that point? Allah, you could have shaped my soul into something else. Although technically we've already addressed why that's impossible. Well, that's the mu'min way of answering it, so that's good. We gave the principles, but we didn't expand and connect how those principles actually lead to this, but we'll do that inshallah. Recite as-salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. I think your iPad wants the class to be finished. It's okay. Ahsant. Yeah, you got it. You're an arif. Subhanallah. So now, we already know that, okay, we got it. It's differentiation, sure, but how do you get there? So literally just calls the next subsection, the secret of differentiation. And it's, oh, I missed it by God. It's all right. Let me see if there's it on my phone next time. I get it. We'll end soon, don't worry. That's right, thank you. So, in other words, so if, here, I'll just hold it, maybe it'll help. Okay. If Allah's faith, His grace, His generosity, all this stuff, it's absolute. We already said, or the claim is that He doesn't withhold anything from anybody. I said, okay, then why are all these things being decided differently? Again, why are you deciding to make it different? That's the idea. So, he says, this thing is answered, the secret of it is just one sentence. Obviously, he makes this one sentence, but then has to explain it in paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs. But the one sentence, and I'll just quote from the English, the differences between beings are innate and essential, meaning dhati. And the necessity of the system of causes and effects. It's like, oh, obviously. What does that mean? So, this is why in this section he said we have to talk about what order means first. These numbers, they have different values. Can 2 ever say, hey, how come I'm not number 1? No, when you are 2, you're 2, based on the inherent nature of you. If you get put in another position, it's impossible, you cannot be. If you could have been, you would have been the number 1, so it's already an impossible question to even ask, right? So the principle that we're going back to is the one that we talked about actually over here, that from one thing, you can only get one other thing. From one, you only get one. So now we go to the Quran. He says, oh, actually, you know what, let me draw it out first. And that's going to turn off again, right? Sorry. How much time do we have left? Okay. We'll end in a few minutes anyway. But, so, first let me explain how we normally think of creation. So when we think about Allah's irada, right? Okay, Allah, you intended to create something, right? So obviously Allah, He's sitting there on His arsh, on His throne, right? We don't know how we know what we mean here, but He's like, okay, nothing's created yet, so let me now decide to create. So He makes an intention that, okay, I'm going to make Adam, alayhi salam. Then He's got a separate one, okay, I'm going to make Iblis. Again, Allah's not bound by time, so get the idea out, but I'm saying that that's how we think about it. All right, Iblis, he has a separate one for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, right? He has another one for you and me. He has another one for rocks, or each individual rock. That's how we all think about it, is that Allah, for everything, He makes إِذَا إِرَادَ شَيْءٍ يَقُولُ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونَ. He has an irada, He says, kun fayakun, be. So, again, I'm giving a random number. Let's say from the beginning of quote-unquote time up until now, let's just say that there was, I don't know, like 100 trillion different things. Obviously, it's a lot more than that, but let's say 100 trillion different things that come into existence, right? In our minds, and what classical scholars believe is that Allah has a separate intention for each and everything, meaning He's got 100 trillion intentions. An irada for this, irada for that, irada for that, irada for that, and an irada for that. Now, the irada for me, does that have anything to do with, for any of us, that obviously in order for us to come to being, you have to have the parents. Is that irada part of me or is that separate from me? Is it a package deal that Allah's irada is like, well, in order to make you, that's what's going to have to happen, is that these parents? Well, actually, in order for that to happen, there's got to be whatever grandparents, Sorry, grandparents, I don't know what happened to your arms. Right? And then this one needs grandparents too. Is that now part of the package too? He said it has to, why does it have to be like that? It has to be part of the package because it's part of the package, yeah. As he said, because this order, yeah, because of the order, because me being who I am to be born in this year, on that day, with this time, was based on a certain type, as you were saying before, of cause and effect. That was a real thing. It wasn't just made up randomly. In order for that to happen, other specific cause and effect needed to happen with those entities as well too. The idea of time and months and temperature, all these things needed to be part of the package in order for each and every one of these things to be there. So what he says is that the problem is that we're thinking all of this is one separate thing. It's not. I mean, as all different intentions and irada. He's like, that's not how it is. And then he says, it's one thing that Allah does. It's one irada and that's it. Allah only has one intention. And then he gives, again, the proof from the Quran. Surah Al-Qamar, Surah 54, ayat 49 through 50. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Inna kulla shay'in khalaqnahu biqadr. That without a doubt, indeed, we created every single thing in a qadr, in a measure. In order for me to be here, I had to be measured out first. Right? This specific measure had to be done for, in order for this to happen, well, this cause, and right, X, and then Y, and then Z, and all this stuff will eventually lead to whatever, Hassan Rizvi being born in this way. And then the next ayah, ayah 50. وَمَا أَمْرُنَا إِلَّا الْوَاحِدَةِ. Our amr, our command is only one. Or literally, it's nothing except for one. And this is where the philosophers and Urafah say, look, we are going by the Quran, we're not making this up. Allah is saying himself that our command, our amr is one thing. One command takes care of all of creation and existence. It's everything. Kalamhil basar, like the blinking of an eye, the glancing of an eye. It's just one thing, right? So that analogy of this blinking or glancing of an eye, when you look, do you have to look at each and every object like individually, or is it all now, like you have this whole field of vision? It's one thing. It's a beautiful analogy that Allah is giving in the Quran like this. Like this is one picture that we're getting from the eyes. He said, Allah is seeing out reality like this. When it's unfolding and manifesting from Him, it's not that I have to see this thing first, and then after this and this and this. It's all part of the package. That's how creation works. If that's the case, if it's all one thing, then we're just in a sense like numbers. That in order for my inherent value to be there, right, let's say wherever you have parents, me, whatever, grandparents, it's very similar to the idea of a number line, right? That you cannot start to replace me over here and put me over here. So the idea of prophets and imams is the exact same thing. They are, in a sense, numbers in a line. They have a real and inherent value. When you take that system of cause and effect and put it into place, this is the reality that you end up with. Now, so Allah doesn't have a separate irada and intention for each thing. It's all part of one. Now, what are these things? There's two kinds of orders. One is called a vertical order, and there's another one called a horizontal order. And these are the next two subsections. He wants to describe, because we obviously have parents, which are a cause, and a grandparent, which is a cause, and the idea of I can't be here unless there's such a thing called time and space, and I can't be here unless angels were sent down by Allah to, do what they were commanded to do. How do I put all this order like in a hierarchy in a picture? He says there's two things, right? There's the vertical. Oh man. Speaking of angels, right? So in the next two subsections, it'll be vertical order, this higher level order, and then the horizontal order that we experience in this world. So that'll be the next two subsections. Any questions before we end? Can you hear the questions? No? The cliffhanger? The cliffhanger is, what is a good cliffhanger? We'll add it in post, we'll add it in post, inshallah. Okay, so we'll end for tonight. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ahli baytihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.